Good afternoon, everybody. This is the first of our talks about the disciples. We have got 4 throughout the course of the month, and we're starting with Peter. Now, Peter was probably one of the more famous, shall we say, of the disciples because of certain incidents that we read about in the the Gospels, and also because he wrote letters as well. So we can build up quite a good picture of Peter. Now, I often say that if Jesus is the person who we're meant to try and emulate, the disciples are the people who we are. And what we often see when we study the disciples is we study very human people making very human mistakes and trying to do what's best, but quite often failing. And so I think what's always a useful exercise to do is to look at the disciples to see where they failed, the mistakes they made, and try and not make them ourselves. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is to look at Peter's background, look at a few sort of notable incidents in his life, and then compare them to us and see how, in many respects, we are all like Peter. So first of all, just looking at his background, and we could spend an entire afternoon just looking at this, but what I've just done is sort of summarised, if you like, all the important parts. So we get an idea of who Peter was. And there are references on the screen there, so if you want to check these out to make sure that they are correct, please feel free. So we know he was originally called Simon. We know he was born in Bethsaida. We read that in John chapter 1. And we know that at the time that he met Jesus, he was living in Capernaum. Again, Mark chapter 1 has an account of Jesus healing his mother-in-law. We know he was married, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5. We read about that, and again also in that instant in Mark, and that he and James and John were partners in a profitable fishing business. We've just read that as an introductory reading, haven't we? So we know that he was a businessman, he had business partners, and he was a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee. We know that Simon Peter, met Jesus through his brother Andrew, who had been following Jesus after hearing John the Baptist proclaim that Jesus was the Lamb of God. And again, if you go back to John chapter 1, you can read that incident whereby it was Andrew who brought Peter to Jesus. What we also know about him was that Andrew immediately went to find his brother to bring him to Jesus. When Jesus met Simon, he gave him the new name, Cephas, which is the Aramaic, or Peter in the Greek, which means rock. And again, this is all contained in John chapter 1. Now, we don't know exactly how long after that incident, but we know that later on that, if you like, Jesus officially called Peter, so to speak, to follow him during after the incident we just read about in Luke chapter 5, where Jesus performed the miracle of the catch of fishes. And then, as we read in the last, verse 11 of the chapter we just read together, and when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. So that's how Peter was called. He was called by his brothers, and we know that he left everything and followed. And he was given quite a lot. We know he was a businessman, he was a married man. We don't know if he had a family, but I think it's fair to assume that he probably may have done. So he gave up an awful lot to follow Jesus. And what we see in the 4 Gospels are various incidents when Peter's story comes to the forefront. So what I'd like to do is just go through those 4 or 5 incidents and see what we can make of what type of person Peter was. So if you could open your Bibles, please, because the first one I'd like to go to is in Matthew and chapter 14. I should say all these accounts come from the Gospel of Matthew, And we're going through them in chronological order. So you won't be flicking backwards and forwards. We'll just slowly be progressing through Matthew. So it should be quite easy to follow, hopefully. So Matthew chapter 14, and if we go down to verse 22. Just to put it into context, in chapter 14 of Matthew, just prior to this, he's fed the 5,000, and then verse 22, we read what happens after that. Now, this afternoon I'm reading from the English Standard Version, but please follow whichever version you have in front of you. We read, "Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds," this is the 5,000 plus, "he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, 'It is a ghost!' And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid.' And Peter commanded him, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.' He said, 'Come.' So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, 'O you of little faith, why did you doubt?' And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" So, what we see here in Peter, if you like, are two sort of almost contrasting sides of the same person. When they saw Jesus, they were afraid. And I think something we should always bear in mind with all the disciples is when they saw the miracles of Jesus, when they saw the things that he performed, there were things they'd never seen before. And some of the things that Jesus was talking about were things that they'd never even thought about before. So I think we can slightly give them a bit of leeway for, at times, reacting in the way they did. So the fact that they saw Jesus walking towards them on the water, it's something they'd never seen before, and they just went, they didn't know how to react, and they said, "Is it a ghost?" And Jesus says, "No, it's me." And at this point, Peter, who obviously isn't convinced, says, "Well, if it is you, then call me to walk on the water with you." So Jesus says, "Come to me." Now at this point, what we do see in Peter is an amazing act of faith, because he got out the boat. Now, I don't know about you, but in that situation, it would take a lot for me to even think, even if you're in a boat and you're being tossed around, if somebody said, "No, come out, it's fine," it'd be quite a daunting task to actually come out of what you know and to step into the unknown. But Peter had the faith to do it. And effectively, that's what Jesus asks everybody to do. He asks us all to step out of what we know, to step out of the world that we live in, into the unknown. When we are baptised, we're going into sort of a territory that we don't know, we're not familiar with, we don't really know what's going to happen. But that's what Jesus asks of us. So Peter heard the call and he walked. He got out and he was walking on the water. And at that point, things change. At that point, Peter finds himself in a situation which he can't comprehend, and he starts to lose faith. And as he loses faith, he starts to sink under the water. But what happens? He cries for help, and Jesus pulls him out. And the same goes for us as disciples, is that at times in our lives we walk and we lose faith. We can't comprehend what's happening to us in our lives. We can't comprehend what's happening in the world, and we lose faith, and we feel as though we're drowning. But the message is the same now as it was 2,000 years ago. If we call on Jesus for help, he will help us. So we see two different aspects here, if you like, of Peter. We see a very faithful man, but a man whose faith also failed him. Let's continue on now. Let's go on to onto chapter 16. So just across a couple of chapters to Matthew chapter 16 and another incident with Peter. This starts. We'll start reading this at verse 21. So verse 21. We read that from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. So what Jesus was doing here is he was explaining to Peter and explaining to the disciples what was going to happen, if you like, the plan. Now, the plan had always been that Jesus was going to have to die, because this goes back to the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, after man had sinned, laws were put into place with the Mosaic laws, about the laws of Moses, about offering sacrifices when people sinned. All sinning is doing it means is disobeying God, doing what pleases you and what displeases God. Jesus was to be, if you like, the end of that. He was going to be the final sacrifice. So he had to die. But because Jesus never sinned, he couldn't die. And so he would be raised from the dead. Jesus knew this, and Jesus explained this. This is exactly what Jesus is explaining here to Peter. And what Peter's doing here is he's doing that great thing of selective hearing. What Peter heard was he just heard him say he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed. Because that's what you would focus on, isn't it? And the next line of, and on the third day be raised, well, if you think about it, nobody's ever been raised from the dead. So, again, Peter is struggling to comprehend this. And so what Peter does is, what Peter thinks is, well, that can't be right. Because they knew that Jesus was the Messiah. But the thing was that they didn't, if you like, fully grasp the big picture. A lot of the disciples, and in fact perhaps many of the followers even of Jesus at this time, knew that a Messiah was going to come, that a Saviour was going to come, that was going to, as they saw it, restore the land of Israel from thousands of years ago, the land of the kingdom of David and Solomon and so forth. So they were looking at things in a very sort of narrow, human manner, and they're thinking, but if you're going to be killed, how can you overthrow the Romans? That doesn't make any sense. And so Peter comes along and says, this isn't going to happen. No. I think probably Peter would sort of say, no, I will stop this from happening. And Jesus says, no, don't. And he uses the expression Satan here, and this just means an adversary, because effectively Peter was almost like a spanner in the works. He was saying, no, don't try and stop what is going to happen. And so he's told, you are not setting your mind on the things of God, on the things of man. You're only thinking about yourself and what you understand. What I am telling you is something far greater than that. And of course, ultimately it was, because nobody had ever been raised from the dead before. But it happened with Jesus. So Peter in this case is actually, he's quite argumentative, he's quite sort of petulant, he's kind of saying, no, this isn't going to be. And Jesus says, this has to be, Peter. And there's a good lesson in that for us in life as well, is that we have to often just accept things as being God's way and God's will, even if at times we don't fully understand them. We know that God's purpose will come to pass, and we know it'll all be for the good. Let's just go on then to another situation. And this is in Matthew 17, so it's the next chapter. And at the beginning of the chapter, we read what's usually referred to as the Transfiguration. So what happened here is that Jesus took Peter and James and John, sort of the other, if you like, the brothers. They all went up onto the mountainside, and when they were there, they saw Jesus's sort of persona change, and it said about how he sort of glowed white, and then they saw Moses and Elijah, and they realised that they had seen something very special here. Now, the whole purpose of Jesus was that after he had been that sacrifice for sin, after he was raised, that he would set up God's kingdom here on earth, and when he returns, that is what he'll do. So if you like, what the three brothers got was almost a snapshot of how the kingdom was going to look. I mean, they were in the land, they saw this transformation. So it must have been an incredible experience for them. Again, very hard for them to comprehend exactly what was going on, but they understood, and Peter certainly understood, that there was something special here. Because in verse 4, Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah." Now, what Peter's intentions were is unclear. What did he think? Was he so moved he wanted to do something? Did he feel as though something physically had to be put there to remind people? But whatever it was, he certainly had an opinion about what should actually happen. Verse 5, though, he was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Rise and have no fear." And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. So we've gone from Peter being all very kind of, "Oh, we'll do this. We'll build three tabernacles or 3 shrines, whatever you want to refer to it," to being on the floor shaking with fear when he heard God's voice. Now, actually, if you think about it, the fact that he didn't make them was really a blessing, because what would undoubtedly would happen was that if he had built these 3 things, then 2,000 years later they would have been classed as sort of holy relics or something, and they would have been turned into sort of tourist attractions, and that wasn't Jesus's way, and we don't know where exactly on the mountainside this happened. So actually, Peter not doing it was a good thing. But it's interesting how he changes. He changed from being all confident and "let's do this" to actually sort of quivering on the floor. Our penultimate incident with Peter is over in chapter 26. And this is now coming to the time before the crucifixion of Jesus. And at this point, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and they've just had the Last Supper. They've had bread and wine, and we're coming in part way through. He's had the Passover, and then verse 36. Jesus then goes up to Gethsemane to pray, and then verse 47. While he was still speaking, this is Jesus, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi." And he kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of them who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? So here we have this incident whereby one of Jesus' followers strikes the servant and cuts off his ear. Now, if you look in the John account, it's named as Peter. So we know that this is Peter. And again, we think about Peter's reaction. So they've been told, or they've been prepared, shall we say. Jesus explained at the Passover, at the Last Supper, that, I am going to die. And then at this point, the guards come to arrest him. So at this point, it's looking pretty imminent that Jesus' death is near. So what does Peter do? Bearing in mind that he'd been told beforehand that it was going to happen, and when he tried to say, I will stop this, he was told, no, you won't. Peter takes it into his own hands and decides to get the sword out and try and fight the people who are going to actually come and crucify Jesus. And he's told off again. He's rebuked and said, no, this is not the way it's meant to be. You've got to let this happen. And we know actually again from the John account, Jesus heals the servant, and then ultimately he goes on to be crucified. And so Peter just seems to be violently lashing out here. And you may think, well, that's not exactly the way you'd expect a disciple of Christ to act, but this is what he does. Now, in all fairness, again, trying to get into the mind of Peter, it may be because of an incident that happened a bit earlier on in the chapter. And this is our final thing I want to look at about Peter. And this is about his betrayal. So if you've still got Matthew 26 open, if we just go back to verse 30 of Matthew chapter 26. Again, in context, we've just had the Last Supper. And then verse 30, it says, and when they'd sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, you will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. So again, Jesus is telling the disciples something they don't really want to hear. They don't really want to all be told that they're all going to turn their backs on him. And in fact, Peter answers in verse 33, though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And all the disciples said the same. So at this point, Peter's saying, whatever happens, I will be with you. Which I suppose could perhaps explain his actions with the sword. Perhaps he thought, well, no, I'm not going to deny Christ. I'm going to fight these people. But again, he's missed the point, because that's not really what Jesus meant. But perhaps in his mind, that's what he was thinking, which is why he reacted that way in Gethsemane. But we know, if we go right to the end of the chapter and verse 69, we know what actually happens. It says, now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, you also are with Jesus the Galilean. But he denies it before them all, saying, I do not know what you mean. And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied it with an oath, I do not know the man. After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you. Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know the man. And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. Isn't it amazing how he can change? We said about Peter's faith, about how he had faith to get out of the boat to walk on the water. Then a few minutes later, he lost his faith and he began sinking. Well, here, a few hours after Jesus has said to him, you will deny me 3 times, and he was so adamantly, no, everybody else might turn their back on you, I will stay with you. Within a few hours, he's changed. And the pressure of what's going on. I mean, if we read the rest of the chapter, we'd see about how Jesus was put on trial in this sort of kangaroo court, and they were trying to find trumped-up charges against him. And obviously the atmosphere had turned, and Peter suddenly realised it's not good to actually be connected with Jesus. And he turns his back on him. So, if we look at the character of Peter from what we've seen so far, we know he was petulant, he was disobedient, he quite often did what Jesus told him not to do, and had to be sort of rebuked on 2 or 3 occasions. He was brash, he was potentially violent, and he was a betrayer, and he was a liar. That is the character of Peter as we see in the Gospels. And yet, we also read in Matthew 16 verse 18, Jesus says to Peter, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." So Peter was being held up as being one of the key disciples, one of the key characters in setting up God's kingdom on earth. And yet the man that we've just looked at is not the sort of character that you'd think you would want to be in that sort of a position. The thing is, Jesus saw something in Peter. Jesus saw something that was actually he could work with, that he could build on. And we're not going to do it this afternoon, but if you go through and you look at that, how Peter then, in the Acts of the Apostles, which are the events directly after Jesus had been raised from the grave and then was ascended to heaven, and we read about what Peter and the other apostles did, and we see the amazing things they did and the amazing acts of faith. It's a very different Peter to the Peter that we read about in the Gospels. If we look at the Peter and we look at the way he writes and the words that he says, it's a very different Peter to the Peter that we've seen in the Gospels. Because Peter matured and Peter changed and Peter began to understand what it was that Jesus wanted. And he began thinking less in a worldly way and more in a spiritual way. And the thing is, and this is the most wonderful thing for us, is that in the same way that Jesus saw something in Peter, Jesus can see something in us the same. So if we find ourselves thinking, I could never be a disciple of Christ, I could never be a disciple of Jesus because I'm petulant, I'm disobedient, I'm brash. Or we think about things that we've done previously and we think, well, I'm just not cut out for it. I'm not the type of person that he's looking for. Well, we are wrong. If Jesus can see something in Peter, then Jesus can see something in us. Because the most important thing is it's not where we begin from, it's where we end. So if we think I could never be baptized, I could never live a life trying to follow God's will, trying to emulate Jesus, trying to live in his style, because I'm just not the right type of person. Well, none of us are the right type of person. All of us have these failings. All of us have these problems. But what Jesus we see in his ministry and what we read in all of the Bible is that that's fine. Because as long as we start, that's the most important thing. Peter had to start somewhere, and along Peter's way we saw him fail. We saw him have great moments when he was very confident in his faith, moments when he was lacking in faith. And at that time, Jesus was there to help him. And we know that as we start our journey after we are baptized and we start our journey on, we will fail. But if we fail, we can turn to God through Jesus and ask for forgiveness. And we just basically get whatever we've done wiped out and we start all over again. It's a wonderful, wonderful gift that's on offer. And I think the more that we look at some of these Bible characters, the more we realise that actually we are like the disciples. We make all the mistakes. But the thing is, the disciples we see over their lives changed, and God willing, we will also change as well. And we will become better people than we were when we started. The question is, what the offer is, this is what Christ is offering us. This is what his Heavenly Father has planned for us. Do we want to be part of that wonderful kingdom when it comes here on the earth? And God willing, it will be here soon. Thank you.